Okay, let's do this. Let's get started. What do we want to talk about today? I want us to discuss a couple of terms. I want us to look at the term coup, as in like a coup d'etat, and I want us to look at the term deep state and maybe take a broader glimpse at each of those terms, try and figure out exactly what they mean, maybe try and just have a more expansive perspective as to ways in which we can interpret those, and then maybe try and figure out how those terms define or describe the situation that we're in right now and where maybe even those terms fall a little bit short. So let's start with the first one. Let's start with coups. So this is a term that everyone has heard, right? Um, so what exactly is a coup? You know, everyone knows that the term is originally French, coup d'etat, which if you look at it means kind of like a strike of state or a blow of state. That's what the term would mean literally in French. And it has come to mean some sort of sudden, perhaps violent overthrow of one government administration and then replaced by another. I mean, that's in general terms what people understand when they hear the term coup. So let's talk about that. Let's maybe mention where we think that term is applicable to other situations, perhaps maybe even our own, and where maybe that term doesn't necessarily directly apply, etc. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to show you guys something. So I'm going to pull this up. So here's a book, if you guys can see that. It's called How to Stage a Military Coup from Planning to Execution. So before people freak out, this book is pretty tongue in cheek. It's not meant to be literal. It's not an actual planning guide for how you would literally perform a coup. This is not a book on how you plan a violent military overthrow of your government from your mom's basement. That is not what this book is. So it is written um, with a very humorous undertone to it, and the authors, so David Hebditch and Ken Connor. So one of them is an old SAS guy. That would be, the Special Air Services in the British military, and then the or Special Air Service, and then the other is, I think he's a journalist if I remember correctly. So yeah, David Hebditch and Ken Connor examined with a trained soldier's eye successful as well as failed coup attempts throughout the 20th century. So anyway, so this is a pretty interesting book. I got this book, I don't know, 10, 12 years ago. It's a very interesting read. It's kind of a historical look at many different coups that have been performed, over very, very long periods of time, some successful, some not. And so in that regard, it kind of tells you, hey, here are some of the common ingredients, for coups, et cetera. It's very humorous. This is not an academically rigorous text. It's kind of a fun read, but nonetheless very interesting if you are someone who has wondered about these types of things. But yeah, I mean, there are more scholarly texts out there. But nonetheless, I wanted to start with this one because I actually do like the introduction to this book. So here's what it says. The French expression coup d'etat means a sudden blow of state and dates from 1646. We are not writing about a new phenomenon here. Of course, coups existed long before we gave them the name. Caligula, Claudius, Julius Caesar were just three of many Roman emperors who were propelled into or out of power on the back of military takeovers. Since the 19th century, coups have become a well-established means of achieving what we now call regime change. Indeed, in some countries, coups d'etat are more frequent than government elections. There have been no fewer than 45 coups or coup attempts in Paraguay in the past 100 years. But even Paraguay is upstaged by Bolivia, which can boast some 200 coups, both failed and successful, since it gained independence from Spain in 1825. That makes the fall of Bolivian governments a seasonal event as predictable as the fall of autumn leaves, but considerably noisier. A satirical television sketch once showed a long-suffering government official at his desk. On the wall behind him is a portrait of a mustachioed middle-aged man in a morning suit and blue sash. Below, a plaque reads, Viva el Presidente. Suddenly, in the street outside his window, there is an uproar and the sound of small arms fire. As soon as it subsides, the official emerges from under his desk and flips the picture around. On the other side is the portrait of a mustachioed middle-aged man in military uniform with a chest that groans with medals. This time the slogan reads, Viva el General. Of course, this implies that coups are a Latin American phenomenon, or more disparagingly, a feature of life in banana republics. Coups d'etat are a worldwide political reality in which Africa is a serious rival to Central and South America. All right, I'm skipping a little bit here. Coups d'etat are in many respects an exquisite form of political theater. They have players and a plot. They are structured into a series of mostly well-defined acts. Coups are generally considered to be fundamentally undemocratic. After all, the resulting government is not the outcome of a ballot of the people. That, however, is an oversimplification. Perhaps the highest profile coup since World War II was the 1973 American-backed putsch in Chile. No one has questioned the legitimacy of Salvador Allende's convincing popular election to the presidency. It was just that his politics were too left-wing for Chile's establishment and for the White House of President Richard Nixon. So they plotted together to get rid of him. This was no bloodless coup. Thousands were murdered in the aftermath, and the country stayed in the grip of General Augusto Pinochet until 1990. A very undemocratic outcome to what started as a democratic process. But if coups are fundamentally a bad thing, how do we categorize Portugal's Carnation Revolution? And if you don't know about that, you should look that up. On 25 April 1974, a radio broadcast of the song Grondola Villa Morena signaled the start of a military coup, which was to end one of the longest running dictatorships in the 20th century. Over the following 2 years, Portugal withdrew from all its troubled and troublesome colonies, and at home, liberal democracy was introduced. The coup instigators were left-wing officers, but the putsch was nonetheless an abuse of the trust that goes with being armed. A popular move, as it turned out, but still bullets rather than ballots. A very democratic outcome to what started as an undemocratic process. And therefore a good thing? Question mark. We're going to come back to that. We have just thrown the word democracy around without considering what it means in practice. The Encyclopedia Britannica definition is good enough. A government by the people, especially rule of the majority, a government in which the supreme power is vested in the people and exercised by them directly or indirectly through a system of representation, usually involving periodically held free elections. Another way of looking at the issue would be to say that democracy is a system of government under which the people think they hold supreme power through a system of representation, usually involving periodically held free elections. Okay, that's interesting. All right, so coup. We kind of know what that word means. I mean, most people have heard the word, used the term frequently enough that they have an idea in their head as to what coup means. Now, he mentions, hey, coups have happened all over the world, particularly in parts of the world like Latin America or Africa. Of course, they've occurred in other places too. And he mentions the 1973 coup in Chile. So this one is very well known. He says it's probably the most well-known post-World War II coup. I probably agree with that. I have some familiarity with that one because I spent a lot of time in Chile. And so that was definitely the first country that I would have ever visited that is a country that has had a coup, relatively recently. But I mean, I have been in other countries that have also, experienced coups at some time in their nation's history, and some of them even, quite recently. But that was the first country that I visited, that has had a prominent coup in the last half century or so, at least at the time that I visited. I guess now it's been, more than 50 years. But anyway, I was there, I visited Chile, decades ago. But anyway, and I'll tell you a quick story just because it's kind of funny. Um, so on the morning of 9/11, I was a cadet at West Point. I was in my third year at West Point. And so I was at breakfast. And at breakfast, you got the upperclassmen around the table. There are 10 people at a table. And there are a couple of underclassmen, typically about three, that sit at the end of the table. And so I was in my third year. I was a junior, right? So as is typical, the upperclassmen kind of, play around with the underclassmen a little bit. And so this is the morning of 9/11. So September 11th, 2001. So I said to one of the underclassmen, one of the plebes, I said to him, "Hey, what happened on this date in Chile in 1973?" And I mean, of course, he had no idea. Like why would he know that? But what I was referring to was the overthrow of the government by Pinochet, and we can talk about that much more in another video. There's a lot that could be said about that. There's a lot of controversy around that event that is has nothing to do with what I really want to talk about today. But so of course this underclassman has no idea, and why would he? I was just kind of playing with him a little bit. So I said, "Hey, um, look it up and let me know at lunch." Now this is common. You'd kind of play with the underclassmen. It happened to me when I was an underclassman, and you'd get asked some obscure question. You wouldn't know the answer to it, and then now you owe a report. And by owe a report, I mean I expected him to just look it up and come give me like a, the 90-second, explanation at lunch. It's not like I was expecting him to put together some crazy report. I just wanted him to look it up and tell me what it was that he learned. Okay, great. But I never got that report because in between breakfast at like, I don't know, 7 that morning or whatever, and then lunch, of course, our entire meaning of, September 11th would totally change because of what would happen in those few hours between breakfast and lunch, right? So, but my point in sharing that story is, if you don't know, the 1973 coup in Chile occurred on September 11th, 1973, which is why I was asking him, "Hey, what happened on this date in 1973 in Chile?" As if he would know, which of course he didn't. Okay, great. Next book, The Good Coup: The Overthrow of Manuel Zelaya in Honduras, Marco Cáceres de Iorio. All right. I've also spent a lot of time in Honduras. I was stationed there for a year. Before that, I had visited Honduras multiple times for work with the Army. I was aware of this incident when it occurred. I had worked with Honduran military. I've worked a lot with the Chilean military. So when this coup occurred in 2009, I mean, I remember knowing about it right when it occurred. So again, we're not going to talk about exactly what happened with the 2009 coup in Honduras. You can go look that up. But I want to read the preface to this book. This is by the author. "I thought long and hard about the title of this book. I chose The Good Coup, knowing full well that it would please no one and probably anger some." I like that. "On the one hand, those who believe that the overthrow of Manuel Mel Zelaya as president of Honduras on June 28, 2009 was a military coup d'etat, or golpe de estado, that would just be coup d'etat in Spanish, or more literally a hit job on the state, will no doubt take issue with my characterization of what occurred as good. On the other hand, those who believe Mr. Zelaya's overthrow was a constitutional transition of power will take exception to my use of the word coup. While the former assumes that all coups are inherently bad because they involve the forceful removal of a sitting president, and in this case, one who is democratically elected, the latter assumes that using the word coup automatically delegitimizes what occurred. I hold a different view." Okay, I love this. This is great. So again, regardless of what you think about this particular incident, and I know that most of you probably don't know a lot about what happened in 2009 in Honduras, I like the fact that he is managing the tension and the inherent contradiction in this this term, the good coup. I mean, he's saying, hey, I realize that a lot of people are going to view this as an oxymoron, that there's an inherent contradiction there, and he's using that ambiguity deliberately, which I like. I think that's cool. As a rule, I believe coups are a bad thing, just as war is a bad thing. Both should be avoided and discouraged because they usually involve killing people, often innocent people, and the destruction of property and disruption of public order, civility. They leave societies traumatized and turn back the clock on their development. Yet most people would agree that there is such a thing as a just war, that sometimes situations become so threatening and unbearable that the use of force is the only effective response left. I apply the same logic to coups. If you can have a good war, then why can't you have a good coup? Certainly, wars are infinitely worse than coups. They last longer, they kill more people, and they are murkier from a legal standpoint because they usually involve two or more sovereign nations in the violation of geographic borders. Unfortunately, too much of the debate about Mr. Zelaya's overthrow has been dominated by the questions of whether the action was a coup or not a coup, and whether it was constitutional or not constitutional. Obviously, these are important questions. The problem is that there does not appear to be a clearly right or wrong answer. Those on each side of the argument make valid points. It largely depends on your perspective of the events leading up to the morning of June 28th, and again, that would be 2009, and how you wish to interpret the Constitution of Honduras, and whether you give more weight to some articles over others. What I constantly find myself telling people who ask for my opinion about the political crisis in Honduras is, look, it's not black or white. Mostly there's a lot of gray. Okay, again, we're not going to talk about exactly what happened in Chile in 1973 or what happened in Honduras in 2009. What I wanted to do is just give a little bit of context to that word coup. Are coups inherently bad? Great question. Can a coup ever be good? As this author, Marco Cáceres de Iorio, poses. Now, I'm not here to take a stance on that one way or the other. I mean, I would agree with him in his preface where he says, as a general rule, I think that coups are bad because we tend to think of a coup. One, we tend to think of it as being violent, but perhaps not always. People have heard the term bloodless coup. But we also tend to think of a coup as being something that happens extra legally. It is something that occurs outside of the accepted legal framework of a country. Now, he says, hey, wars are bad too. When wars happen, they happen as a last result because other recourses have failed. So using that same logic, could you say that, hey, under some extreme circumstances, could a coup ever be permissible? Now, I'm merely acknowledging the importance of that question. I'm not taking a stance one way or the other. I am merely saying I understand that could be a valid question, not necessarily giving an answer because I don't know that there is a great answer. And I'm certainly not saying that we in this country should perform a coup. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm about to say is that if anything, I think that we should perform a counter coup, though I'm not advocating that we do that violently. But what I'm trying to show here is that we are in the midst of a coup. That's kind of the point that I'm driving at. Okay. And so with that said, I'm gonna bring something up here. All right. Okay, let me read. I'm going to read a tweet that I put out. When did I put this out? Okay, I put this out a year ago, like 14 months ago. Okay, here's what I wrote. I'm going to read this to you guys, and you guys tell me what you think. Okay. So I said, most people have an overly rigid view of what a coup is. It doesn't have to be a sudden, often violent overthrow slash ouster of one group by another to control a government. A coup can also be executed over time. It may consist of a gradual transitional arc, perhaps punctuated by certain events that move the ongoing coup into successive stages of completion. This arc ends with the government in different hands, just as occurs with a more standard coup. 9/11 was clearly necessary to prep this to prep the stage for the COVID op. Before that, the JFK assassination was monumental in moving the coup along, and the coup arc was already in motion well before JFK. Okay, so what am I saying there? All right, so I'm putting forward this idea that, hey, we tend to think of a coup as being something that happens, very suddenly, and typically the term connotes some sort of violence. That there was a sudden violent overthrow or an ouster of one administration or one political leader or one political party that is then replaced by another. Okay, and what I'm saying is, okay, hey, let's like, I understand that happens. Like, I mean, historically, there are many, many, many examples of that happening, and of course, we know that many of those have been backed by Western powers, whether it's the CIA or other. The UK has certainly sponsored many coups as well. But anyway, I acknowledge that those happen. It's important to understand that those have happened. What I'm saying, though, is, can we look at this more broadly? And can we say, hey, they don't have to be sudden. They don't even necessarily have to be violent. That it could consist of an arc that occurs very gradually. There's an incrementalism to what happens. And so you have this long arc, but on that arc, there are certain discrete events that occur over time. And then I mentioned a couple of those that I think have happened in our own case, and I mentioned specifically, hey, there's the COVID op, which happened, a couple of years ago. But before that, you had 9/11. And I do believe that 9/11 was a stage setting event that would then facilitate, the execution of the COVID op 2 decades later. But you can back up before that. I mentioned, the JFK assassination, but in between the JFK assassination and 9/11, you had other events. I mean, look at the Gulf of Tonkin. The Gulf of Tonkin is another one of those events. But even if you go back before the JFK assassination, there are other events, of course, too. So now some people will say, yeah, but coup implies sudden. It's the French word for strike or blow. I mean, it occurs, it implies something that happens suddenly, and therefore it's, somebody might say to me, hey, you're talking about other ways in which a transition of power might occur outside of the accepted legal framework, but coup implies sudden. And I'd say, okay, I'm with you. I don't necessarily disagree, but my point in sharing this here is not to debate the use of the term coup and get into an argument over semantics. It's more that, hey, let's look at the way in which transitions of power could occur in ways that are not endorsed by the people. Okay, so you could have a coup that is very quick, very violent. You could even have a bloodless coup, but that still operates outside the legally accepted framework of, whatever country. Otherwise, it's not a coup. But there could be other gradual transitions that occur in which you eventually get to a new form of government or a new apparatus of government. And so the end state would be the same as a coup. You just got there far more gradually. Okay, so that's my point, more than it is, that I'm dogmatically holding on to the term coup or not. Okay, great. Glad we had that discussion. So the next thing that I want to talk about, and then I'll tie this together, is a term that we have talked about before, and that's the term deep state. And then there are related terms such as deep events, deep politics, right? So the deep state engages in deep events that are part of ongoing deep politics. I mean, you could kind of, you can kind of draw those terms together in that way. And when I talk about these events that would happen over this gradual arc, right, such as the COVID op, 9/11, the Gulf of Tonkin, the JFK assassination, the creation of the Fed in 1913, plenty of others, we could refer to those as deep events, which means there are layers of purposes, there are layers of objectives that are behind those events, or objectives that are the reasons why those events were carried out. But we've talked about deep state before, but I do want to talk about it again. And so what I want to do is I want to look at a book here that I think we've spoken about before, but I'm going to read some different parts of it. And this book is called American War Machine, right? And it's by Peter Dale Scott. I've talked about Peter Dale Scott before, right? Okay, so the book is called American War Machine. The subtitle is Deep Politics, the CIA Global Drug Connection, and the Road to Afghanistan, okay? And we're going to talk about Peter Dale Scott as we have before, because Peter Dale Scott is the one who, he did not coin the term deep state. But what he did do is he kind of introduced that term into not just into English, but also into specifically the American vernacular. Though I do believe it's been twisted, since he kind of introduced the term into the American vernacular. Now, before we talk about the deep state, I do want to mention one thing. When we talk about a coup, because this is going to be important as we go through a discussion about the deep state and what the deep state is and isn't. I just want to pose some questions. Can a coup involve the deep state taking over the real government? Now, remember, the deep state, in the way that we typically understand that term, the deep state wants to stay hidden. So is the deep state a parasite? Do they need a host? I mean, is that, are they bleeding off of the host? Is that an apt analogy, or is it not? What do you guys think? You tell me. Spiritually, I kind of think that they do, bleed off of the host spiritually. But in a more direct sense, do they need a host? Are they a parasite in that regard? Is that an apt analogy? You guys, let me know what you think. But also, do they want to carry out some sort of total absolute coup in order to be now openly in charge, if that makes sense? When a coup occurs, after the coup occurs, there's no longer any, the way we typically understand the term, there's no confusion as to now who is in charge. It's not like they're operating from the shadows, on the back end of the coup. Now they're openly now in charge, right? So is that what the deep state wants, or does the deep state want to continue to operate from the shadows? These are questions. I'm not necessarily saying one way or the other. These are just things that I'm thinking about. Maybe other people have thought about this too. So I want to know what you guys think. And then I want to make one more note before I do some reading here. When we talk about deep state, the deep state is not a synonym for bureaucracy. Bureaucrats can be part of the deep state, but the fact that they're bureaucrats doesn't necessarily mean that they are part of the deep state. So, you got these guys, these unelected officials that are all over, the organs of government. These old graybeards, they got a lot of experience, and then these elected officials come along and they sometimes have conflicts as to what each group wants. And that's going to be inherent in any organization. The government's no different in that regard. That's not exactly what the deep state is. Okay. So yes, there's bureaucracy in government and in any large organization. That's true. There will be faction in terms of what different groups want vis-a-vis other groups. Okay. Again, that doesn't necessarily mean that one of those factions is the deep state. Okay. The term means something far more significant, and we're going to get to that. So I just want to make sure that there's been a lot of twisting of this term deep state, and it does not just mean bureaucracy, though I would say that a large part of our bureaucracy and government is part of the deep state or has become co-opted by the deep state, but they're not synonyms. Okay. The other thing that I would say is that the deep state is not the deep state is not that term does not only apply to the left. Okay, so when did the deep state? So this term has been around for a couple of decades, right? But it became a household term, I would say, with the 2016 election, right? So when Trump was campaigning, and then of course went into office the first time, right? He was meant to be this opponent of the deep state, that he is this champion of freedom that is fighting back against the deep state, and that he is opposing and resisting, and that he is going to cut the corruption of the deep state. I mean, that's kind of the way he campaigned in 2016, and the same thing this last election, and then the same thing now. So he is being presented as this anti-deep state candidate. Okay. So maybe you like Trump, maybe you don't. Yeah, I've been very open about my thoughts on that. Uh, not really my objective to get into that here. But my point is, regardless of what you think, regardless of where you are on the political spectrum, or even if you're not on the political spectrum, or what you think about Trump, it's important to understand what the deep state is and isn't. So it is not just bureaucracy, and it is not something that only exists on the left. The deep state, in the way that we should understand the term, has to be much broader than that. It has to be much more powerful than that. And it can't be so simply boxed into just one side of the political spectrum, or it would have limited power. Whether that side of the political spectrum be left or right. Typically, the way in which the term has been used the last decade or so, people on the right have tried to accuse people on the left as being part of the deep state or the deep stater. It's almost become synonymous with the left, and that's not what the deep state is. So if you're on the right and you have critiques of people on the left, could you say that those people are part of the deep state? Yeah, you could, because some people on the left, they may be part of the deep state, either perhaps knowingly or perhaps unwittingly, or perhaps they've been co-opted and don't even realize it or whatever. The exact same thing has happened on the right as well. That has to be that way. Otherwise, the deep state would have no real power. And most of us would concede that, yeah, the deep state has a lot of power. Of course it does. So what exactly is it? All right, let's try to understand that. So, okay. So this book, American War Machine, Peter Dale Scott, he's written a bunch of books. He was a professor. So I'm starting in chapter 1 and I'm reading, okay? And it says here, this is literally the first paragraph of chapter 1. In 1996, the crash of a speeding Mercedes on a Turkish highway near Susurluk opened a window into the darker side of Turkish politics, and eventually the darker face of globalization as well. Any one of the victims would have made the local news, but the biggest news was that they were traveling together. Okay. Why are we talking about Turkey? This book is called American War Machine. And in the first sentence of chapter 1, he mentions a Turkish highway and Turkish politics. Why? All right, well, here's why. So the term deep state that we use in English is a direct translation of a Turkish term that was used to describe the state of Turkish affairs. Okay, so deep state is a Turkish term. I can't remember if I said that earlier. I know I've said it in other videos. That was imported into our lexicon and popularized largely by Professor Peter Dale Scott. Okay, so 1996, there's this incident that occurs. Starts with a car crash, and it is known as the Susurluk incident, and it kind of reveals what will become known as the deep state, or at least it was the event that brought that term out that then allowed that term to then be exported into other languages and used in other places. Okay. So I'm skipping down. Um, Found in the wreckage of the car crash were the bodies of a member of parliament, a former deputy police chief, a beauty queen and her lover, a politically connected heroin trafficker, and murderer named Abdullah Khatli. The intrigue was heightened by the contents of the car: a cache of narcotics, thousands of US dollars, pistols with silencers, machine guns, and 6 different sets of official identity documents for Khatli, including a special green passport for public officials signed by the Turkish Minister of the Interior. The more the press researched this so-called Susurluk incident, the more complex it became. All right, so there's this incident that occurs in Turkey, and you got these individuals that seemingly should have nothing to do with each other, but they're all in this car together, and then the car crashes. All right. So what this revealed was you had this nexus of Turkish government officials, crime syndicates in Turkey, like Turkish mafia, basically, and this ultra right-leaning group called the Gray Wolves that possibly had connections to the CIA and possibly even to NATO's stay-behind units like Operation Gladio type stuff, if you're familiar with that. Okay, so again, my point here is not to talk a lot about Turkish history or the Turkish deep state. I'm just giving you some context as to where the term came from, because it originated from Turkey. And so it's important that we understand that when the Turks would use this term, they're not just talking about Turkish government bureaucracy. It's much more complex than that, and it's much more sweeping than that. All right, more than a decade earlier, Turkish General Turhan had said of counter-guerrilla, which had tortured him, "This is a secret unit of the NATO countries." All right, so we're talking about NATO, stay behind stuff. This is Operation Gladio type stuff. So in the extended discussions of the Susurluk incident, the concept emerged in Turkey of a deep state, underlying the public state, consisting of a parastatal alliance between the official police and the criminal death squads they were supposed to round up. Let's stop right there. Okay, so you got some sort of connection and some sort of alliance that on the surface doesn't make any sense, because you got the police and you have criminal elements. They should be in opposition to one another, but there's some sort of secret alliance that's going on there. Okay. But there were clearly international as well as national aspects to the Gray Alliance represented by the Turkish deep state. The problem of sanctioned violence and a deep state, in other words, was not just a Turkish phenomenon, it was a global problem. And what was striking was that the international milieu of backdoor violence frequented by Khatli, so this is one of the dudes that was involved in that car accident, and Delakiye, the Gray Wolves, so this is this ultra right-wing nationalist political party in Turkey, the World Anti-Communist League, the Chilean secret police, and the Bolivian government after the so-called cocaine coup of 1980, was everywhere accused of financing covert operations with the aid of the narcotics traffic. Under the dictatorship of General Augusto Pinochet, for example, the Chilean army and secret police exported tons of cocaine from Chile to Europe. All right. Okay, so we got a Turkish problem that's part of a much larger global problem. And we got factions in Turkey that are involved with, right-wing dictators in South America. And also, potentially involved with, the CIA, the World Anti-Communist League, et cetera. In discussions of the Turkish deep state, 2 aspects have been perceived: the potentially larger condition of a shadow government, or a state within a state, is what we may call the deep state phenomenon. But there was also the more operational sense of the deep state connection, a hard-edged coalition of witting forces, including intelligence networks, official enforcement, illegal sanctioned violence, and an internationally connected drug mafia. I'm going to read that again. All right, so you got the state within a state. That's the deep state phenomenon. But there was also the more operational sense of the deep state connection, a hard-edged coalition of witting forces, including intelligence networks, official enforcement, illegal sanctioned violence, and an internationally connected drug mafia. All right, I'm going to pause for a second. Now, so that gives us a glimpse into what is meant by the term and its actual origin, which is Turkish. Okay. Now let's think about that through its application to us here. Today, everything that has ever, let's see. Okay. Today, everything that has ever been labeled invisible government or shadow government can be considered parts of that machine, meaning the American war machine. Not just the CIA and organized crime, but also such other non-accountable powers as the military-industrial complex, now the financial military-industrial complex, privatized military and intelligence contractors, public relations agents, media magnates, and even Washington's most highly organized lobbyists. Now, a word about the deep state. I'm sorry, about the military-industrial complex. So he says, hey, we now need to think of the military-industrial complex as the financial military-industrial complex. But I would add that we also need to think of it in terms of like that industrial component nowadays is also, it must include big tech and big data. So it's not just about military hardware anymore, though that's still very, very important, but it's also about, big data. And part of that is financial, but a lot of that is also intelligence collection, which can be used for surveillance abroad as well as domestically, et cetera. And then you can use your imagination as to how AI could be used as well there. What we are describing is not just a neutral power apparatus, but an apparatus with a settled purpose, a manipulative mindset fixed on achieving and maintaining global dominance. Today, the mindset does more to determine the choice of president than the president to determine the choice of mindset. Very interesting. Okay, a little bit more we're going to read here. In The Road to 9/11, which is another one of his books, I followed the work of Ola Tunander and labeled America a dual state. But that term is more easily applicable to countries with severely limited rule of law, ranging from Colombia, Pakistan, and Turkey to Russia and China. Okay, so America's a dual state. Okay, that's what he says. So he says, hey, in another book, I've used the term dual state to describe America. But that term is more easily applicable to countries with severely limited rule of law. Then he gives a couple of examples. Colombia, Pakistan, the aforementioned Turkey, and, even Russia and China. Former Turkish president and prime minister Süleyman Demirel once commented on the duality revealed by the Susurluk incident and a related killing in Sindenli. So this former Turkish president, said, quote, "It is a fundamental principle that there is one state. In our country, there are two. There is one deep state and one other state. The state that should be real is the spare one. The one that should be spare is the real one." Unquote. So this Turkish president, that Peter Dale Scott is citing here, this Turkish president, former Turkish president, says, hey, when you think of the state has to be singular. The state is a sovereign entity. But yet here in our country, meaning Turkey, there are two. There's a deep state and another state. And then he mentions kind of this ambiguous relationship between the two. And he says, the one that should be the spare one is the real one. The state that should be real is the spare one. The one that should be spare is the real one. All right, I'm reading here again. Quite independently, Father Javier Giraldo in Colombia has described the same duality in the Colombian state. The Colombian state is contradictory. It tries to fulfill two functions. On the one hand, it's a violent, discriminatory institution that must favor a small, wealthy minority. Even basic necessities are denied to the great majority of its people. By its very nature, at its core, it is not democratic. On the other hand, in public discourse, it presents itself as a state based on law, one that respects and implements justice, human rights, norms, democratic laws. Okay, let's pause right there. So, Father Javier Giraldo, I'm not sure who that is. I'm assuming a priest, had said about Colombia, a country whose military I've also worked with quite a bit, and a country that I've also spent some time in, but I've only been there once, and so I guess I only spent like 10 days there. But if you're familiar with the history of Colombia, it has a very, very colorful history, very, very violent, fascinating place. But this guy, Father Javier Giraldo, he says, hey, the Colombian state is contradictory because it's gotta fulfill two functions, and these two functions are in tension with one another. On the one hand, it's got to be discriminatory, and it has to consolidate power and resources in the hands of the few at the expense of the many. Okay, that's basically what he says. I'm paraphrasing here, hopefully not badly. But then on the other hand, in public discourse, it presents itself as a state based on law, one that respects and implements justice, human rights, norms, democratic laws. All right. Father Giraldo goes on to say, how do government functionaries manage this contradiction? They maintain a duality, the parastate, which is a very similar term to deep state. A structure that is illegal and clandestine, increasingly takes over the dirty work, the repression. It doesn't appear to be part of the state. For many years now, Colombia's government has been creating and maintaining these structures. The legal, constitutional structure exists parallel to structures of a parastate and paramilitary. All right, this is Peter Del Scott again. Turkey's deep state is very similar to Colombia's parastate, and illegal drug trafficking is a major factor in the financing of both. Today, America's deepest forces are not manifested in an external parastate, as in Turkey and Colombia, but rather at the heart of the dominance or war machine to be found both inside and outside the public state. Okay. Very interesting. What have we learned? What from the way in which the term describes Turkey, deep state, or the way in which the term parastate describes Colombia, what about that can be applied to us, and what maybe can't be applied? Okay, because I think it's important that we maybe note some distinctions here. So let's do a very, very quick review. So the term deep state originates from Turkey. This incident occurs in the 90s that is called the Sasurlik incident. This was this car crash, right? So what it reveals is that there is this connecting nexus between elements within the Turkish government and then this ultra right-wing nationalist party known as the Grey Wolves that probably has CIA connections and connections to Gladio stay-behind units across Europe, and also Turkish, crime syndicates. So there's some connecting nexus there that is influencing Turkish politics. Now, what's the statement about the Colombian parastate? Hey, you've got this duality in nature with the state there, because you have the state on the one hand has to carry out these functions that are illegal and are in direct contradiction to what the state says it stands for. So how do you manage that contradiction? Well, you have to have kind of this parastate that deals with all the ugly stuff. And not said there, but you can imagine there that kind of executes some of these functions in a way that permits the other part of the state plausible deniability. That's not stated explicitly, but we can probably read that in. I want to note a very important distinction here, and that is loyalty. Okay. So let's use the Colombian model. That group that is executing all these extra legal functions, okay, trying to consolidate resources in the hands of the few for whatever reasons, and we're not even talking about whether that's good or bad, but the way that it was stated in the book by this father that was making the statement, he is saying it as if it's bad but necessary. That's what he's basically saying. I'm not here to agree or disagree. What I'm saying is the way that that is written, and by the way, I do think that's bad, but that's not my point. But the way that that's written is it's written as if that group that's doing the dirty work is still loyal to Colombia. And that's important for us to note. They're still loyal to Colombia. So you got these two groups. One has to kind of reside and operate in the shadows, and the other maybe can't, recognize it, right? But they're both operating to keep the state functioning. Now, we may have massive problems with how, the one group is doing that. Again, that's not exactly my point here. What I'm saying is it's important for us to understand that the way that I read that, I think the way that it's intended is, in that case, though, they are operating with a sense of loyalty to Colombia. Hey, I got to do all this bad stuff. I know it's technically illegal, blah, blah, blah. But if we don't do it, the state will fall. The state will collapse. And if you know anything about, Colombian history, I mean, just between the Medellin and the Cali cartels, and then the 40-year war with the FARC. I mean, there's a lot of, and all of that is after the era in Colombia that is simply known as la violencia, in which hundreds of thousands of people were killed. So Colombia's had some real problems over the last century, for sure. I don't want to minimize that, but again, that loyalty is extremely important, because I think what's going on, and I'm going to talk about the United States right now, though I think this also applies to many other countries, is I think there is this empire that exists across the world that is, seeking to enslave a lot of people, seeking to consolidate a lot of power, assets, and resources. And therefore, this empire, which doesn't necessarily belong to any state out there and very much operates in the shadows, it views many of these sovereign states out there almost as colonies of its empires, or certainly as vassals. And that there are elements within each of what we would think of as the countries out there that this empire views as its colonies or its vassals. There are elements within those countries, to include the United States, that are not loyal to the United States. They're loyal to that globalist empire. So my question here is, when we use the term deep state here, are we describing some faction that operates in the shadows, does all types of bad stuff, illegal stuff, etc., but does it because it's loyal to the country and just feels that it has to do, all this unpleasant stuff? Or are we using it to describe something that is part of an international apparatus whose loyalty is to something else, a globalist empire? Because typically when I use the term deep state, that's what I'm referring to. And that's why I think that it's important that we understand that concept of loyalty. Are we talking about a faction that operates in the shadows, does a lot of unsavory stuff, but is at least loyal to the country? That does not in any way excuse what they do. Or are we talking about something that is working to subvert the institutions of this country because it is ultimately not loyal to the United States? Because its loyalty resides with some other entity, which could be this global empire that I do think very much exists and, operates from within the shadows. So let me tie all this together. What we talked about with, the coups, what we talked about with the discussion of the deep state. It's kind of my thesis statement here is that We are in the midst of an ongoing arc of some sort of government takeover, whether you want to refer to it as a coup or not, in which the deep state, itself loyal to the global empire and not our country, is assuming ever more control. That's kind of my thesis. So that yes, there is a deep state. The deep state is not loyal to the United States. It's loyal to this, the you know the the octopus, just to use that imagery that plenty of people use, and aptly so, that has its tentacles and everything, right? That's where its loyalty resides, and therefore it is subverting our institutions, our culture, etc., and that it is increasingly taking over more and more of our government. So that's kind of my thesis. Now, I said before, and I stand by this. I'm not in any way advocating a coup. That's not why I talked about the concept of a coup. I talked about the concept of a coup because I think we're in, right? Even if, and if we want to quibble with that term, that's fine. But we're in the midst of an ongoing arc of government transition. And it's punctuated at certain points within that arc, through certain deep events. And I mentioned some of those before: 9/11, COVID, the JFK assassination, whatever, the COVID op. That's kind of what I think is going on. And so I think that we should engage in counter-coup type activities. And again, this is not about me advocating violence or anything like that, not at all. But what I'm saying is that we need to realize that we're in the midst of this ongoing coup, or this government takeover, and that we do things to try and preserve our own institutions, preserve our culture, and preserve the way in which the government is supposed to operate. And a lot of that means, maybe this sounds paradoxical, but maybe it doesn't, but a lot of that means stripping the federal government of power that it has illegally, unconstitutionally arrogated unto itself, that it should not have. It's kind of, there's that old philosophical question. I think it's called the ship of Theseus paradox. Somebody there fact check me and tell me in the comments if I'm getting this right. I think so. But you guys have probably heard about this if you ever took like a philosophy class or whatever. But it's the question where, okay, you have a ship, and then you gradually replace every part of that ship with a new part, right? Eventually all the parts of the ship will have been replaced. So do you have a new ship? And if you do have a new ship, at what point did it become a new ship? Or is it still the old ship? You just replaced all the parts. Anyway, that's kind of like what's going on with our government, right? Gradually, though sometimes in the shadows, quite covertly, and sometimes quite overtly. So anyway, I hope this made some sense. If anything, I just wanted to give a little bit of context to both the term coup, and I wanted us to kind of think about, well, is there such a thing as a good coup? And here's why I brought that up about, is there such a thing as a good coup? I'm not necessarily saying there is or isn't, right? It's meant to be a tough question. But what I'm saying is that it's just like with that idea of what's going on with the parastate in Colombia. Are some of these functions, are they permissible as long as they're done with loyalty to the state? Is a coup permissible if it's done out of loyalty to the state and not a desire for personal power, prestige, wealth, etc.? I am not saying the answer to that question is yes, but I want us to kind of grapple with that a little bit, because it's important that we understand. I am then setting that aside, and I'm saying, regardless of what you think about that, and regardless of whether or not you think that stuff is permissible under some set of circumstances that may be exceptionally narrow, what I'm saying is, I don't even think that applies when I'm talking about the deep state the way in which I use the term, because I'm taking loyalty off the table. And I'm saying that I am referring to factions, at least in as much as I'm referring to people who know what they're doing. Their loyalty is to some other, group or international syndicate, whatever you want to call it, that I think is ultimately, evil and demonically inspired. But that's where their loyalty resides. They are not loyal to this country. And as much as we want to talk about deep states in other countries, because they're there, same thing applies. Um, I hope that makes sense. That was a lot. And this is complex stuff. It's not necessarily easy to always wrap your head around. So you guys let me know if I made any sense. Probably not, and that's okay. Sometimes when I share these thoughts, you got to understand, um, I'm trying to thread things together in my own mind so that they make sense too, right? All right. So, hey, appreciate that. Hope you stuck with me. Let me know what you think. Let me know if there are other things that you thought about as I was mentioning some of this stuff. Maybe you came up with other questions, or maybe you thought of some new perspective that I didn't necessarily mention. If so, let me know in the comments below. I appreciate it. Like and share, and have a great evening.